This is the first formal plenary session, and I'll say a little bit about that in a few moments and a bit more about the aims of the conference, and then introduce our two speakers, Alberto Torres and Manuela Mesa. Before I do that, I'd like to ask Professor Neta Schoenflug, who's Chair of Global Education Network Europe, to say a few words. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. On behalf of Jean, we are delighted to welcome you all to the 2021 conference. Jean is one of the co-founders of Angel, and Jean is very glad to co-sponsor this event and to celebrate together with you the quality of and the broadening and the deepening of policy-related global education research. Many of you might know that Jean is the European network of ministries and agencies with national responsibility for funding, policymaking, coordinating, and support of global learning. And we are centrally focused on the need for quality research that relates to the concerns of people who are doing this work. Because without such a research, global education would not have a clear and an evidence-based and theoretically sound policy making. We appreciate very much the financial support of the European Commission and national ministries and agencies through Jeans to do this work together with us. And we are very looking forward for engaging in very constructive debates over the coming days, which bring the research on global education forward, and by this giving all of us a pedagogy of hope and global social justice, which is very important, especially in these days where we see through the worldwide pandemic that global education is much more urgent than it was before, it getting more and more urgencies for that. So I wish all of us a very good and inspiring conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeanette. Thank you for those very kind words. I think one of the things I'd like to say in terms of introducing this conference is to remind ourselves of why we've taken these themes for this particular conference, and Annette briefly touched on those. And I think over the past year or so, it's probably the most challenging year that for many of us have had in our lives in terms of the context in which we've been living and working within. And I think that's created many issues that have often reinforced some of the global issues that exist in the world, but also the sense of showed to me, if not unknown to many of us, why our field of global education and global citizenship education is so important. If anything has shown how interconnected we are, it has been COVID-19. It's shown that we live in a globalized world where what happens in one part of the world has an impact elsewhere. So we very much see that as very much a backdrop to some of the things that we'll be talking about over these 3 days. Secondly, I think in relation to those things, the whole context of what's happening in the world and what's been happening the past 3 years has posed the importance of the theme of global social justice. The inequalities that have existed in the world for many decades have become even reinforced and exacerbated, one could well argue, over the past 18 months. And that's led us to, I think, to hope to encourage within these conference, not just analysing some of those questions and themes that we've all been faced with, but how we look forward to the future. And what is our role in terms of promoting themes of global citizenship and global social justice through these 3 days. I'd like now to introduce Alberto Torres, who is, I'm sure, well known to many of you involved with this conference. Carlos is a professor at University of Los Angeles, University of California, Los Angeles, and is very well known for his work around global citizenship, around democratic education, and for his contribution and building on the work of Paulo Freire. He's been very involved in some of the conversations that have been around global citizenship education recently, and has also worked quite closely with international bodies such as UNESCO. I'd like, therefore, to pass the floor over to Carlos to introduce his presentation. Carlos, over to you, and thank you very much. Thanks for coming to speak to us today.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for the presentation, and congratulations to Jeannie for 20 years. 20 years in academia is a long time. So my point is that I would like to speak about global citizenship education and sustainability as real utopias. Before I do that, my hunch is that we are in the century of sustainability. If you really look at the history of the contemporary history of, I would say, the last 50 years, we are just beginning to put enough emphasis on the question of sustainability right now in this century. So in a way, sustainability is a real utopia, as well global citizenship is a real utopia. But let me start with a generic topic of present and clear dangers and define what are real utopias. The conversation could be very long, but I will just make it in a very short answer using the language of Paulo Freire when he says that they are a possible dream. And at this moment, I think we are a possible dream confronting present and clear dangers. We stand on the precipice of a planetary cliff, two options laid out before humanity. On the one side is the continuous expansion of democracy, the further extensions of human rights and freedoms, and concerted efforts to address the growing threats and realities of global climate change. On the other, the dismantling of democracy in lieu of a populist authoritarian rule, increased attacks on the marginalized, oppressed, and exploited populations of the world, and acceleration in the degradation of planet Earth. The future now unfolds a battle between two dominant discourses. The one that seeks to recapture the heart and imagination of the Enlightenment, properly deconstructed, considering the epistemological debates of the day, and the power of scientific research and rationality to lead us on the road to a brighter future for the great mass of people. The other, an atavistic return to the past, where a small cadre of global elites dominate the political, economic, and cultural worlds, where propaganda and ideology dictate the contours and content of the public sphere, and where multinational corporations and the power elite decree policy by fear at the local, national, and global levels. In this battle, the institutions charged with knowledge production take on increasingly essential role in challenging the paradigm of fake news, insular politics, and discourses of authoritarian nationalism, intolerance, and hate. But before talking about the real utopias of the 21st century, I shall briefly mention three key real utopias of the 20th century. First, the utopia of conviviality in the 20th century, human rights. Human rights emerged in the framework of a post-war as a utopia of conviviality to achieve what is considered the basic human rights that should be respected. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a document that marks a milestone in the history of human rights, elaborated by representatives of all regions of the world with diverse juridical and legal cultures. The declaration was proclaimed by the General Assembly of the United Nations in Paris on December 10, 1948. As we know, the declaration established for the first time the fundamental human rights that should be protected in the whole world and has been translated in hundreds of languages. Though timidly defended at the beginning, while the internationalist utopia of governability based on a model of a state as a central action began to collapse, the regime of human rights emerged slowly, both as a criticism of the utopia of real socialism, as one of the faces, perhaps the human face of globalization. However, human rights needs improvement. We need to find also how to include in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights the rights of nature. This should be a central component in the struggle for global social justice and social justice for the planet in the 21st century. Next, the two main utopias of governability in the 20th century. I suspect that some historian, it has not been done until now, at least I have not read anything substantial, will compare the utopia of the human rights regime with the utopia of the Marxist-Leninist model of governability, and also with the utopia of neoliberalism as a model of governability based on the fundamentalism of the markets. For instance, historian Mary Nolan, a critical historian from New York, finds some complementarity between human rights and the fundamentalism of the market, that is, neoliberalism. Both reclaim the universal application and despise every other ideology. Both adhere to an individualistic methodology, criticize the state, and marginalize the theme of the social. Despite this description, Mary Nolan concluded that there is not an individualized relationship between human rights and market fundamentalism. As a governability alternative, the political economy of neoliberalism emerged in full force in the last quarter of the 20th century as a model of macroeconomic stabilization based on privatization, free trade, the small state, that is, the state having less relevance in the role of creating models of social and economic regulation, and diminution of the external debt. Facing the collapse of the Soviet Union, the neoliberal model was offered to all the emerging countries of Eastern Europe as the recipe to transform their economies, culture, and politics. So let me talk now about the utopia of the 21st century, the Sustainable Development Goals, or Global Goals, a collection of 17 interlinked goals designed to be a blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. I do believe that these goals have very serious contradictions, including fallacies, but compared with the past, this is an incredible utopia, which was included in the UN resolution called the 2030 Agenda, or the Agenda 2030. In the rest of my presentation, I will focus on the proposal for global citizenship education and sustainability, which are the bedrock of the 2030 Agenda. A central premise in this lecture is that there is an elective affinity between global citizenship and sustainability. Following the Bavarian use of the notion in the field of sociology, elective affinity is a process through which two cultural forms, be them religious, intellectual, political, or economic, who have certain analogies, intimate kinship, and meaning affinities, enter in a relationship of reciprocal attraction and influence, mutual selection, active convergence, and mutual reinforcement. In other terms, sustainable development is a twin sister of global citizenship education. If we are in the century of sustainability and wish to achieve the 17 global goals, we must achieve the twin goals of sustainability and global citizenship. Sustainable development has been a concept utilized to inform thinking regarding various policies and sectors addressing the world's more pressing issues: climate change, poverty, food security, water quality, gender inequality, the works. Although the question of sustainability has risen to the top of policy agendas worldwide, there is a limited theory-driven and empirical research regarding the importance that sustainable development has for education policy and practice. In other terms, we don't know whether these sustainable development goals are being implemented. Many governments have endorsed the UN Paris Climate Agreement and its guidelines for sustainable development. Now, it is known that the Paris Agreement is a global climate effort, bringing all nations into a common cause to undertake ambitious efforts to combat climate change and adapt to its effects with enhanced support to assist developing countries to do so. As educational researchers, we should seek to empirically research the contribution of education, teachers, and curriculum and instruction to sustainability. We should analyze the different teacher training institutions in comparative perspective. There are key concepts developed as part of the 4.7 goal of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The first concept is education for sustainable development, which is needed to defend, protect, and enhance the global commons. Moreover, this model of education is concentrated on moving our teaching training program from an anthropocentric model into a biocentric model of education and training, endorsing a biocentric ethics. The second one, which dovetails nicely with the first, is global citizenship education. Both concepts, which are intimately interrelated, may help to advance the defense of the global commons and social justice for the planet. We have discussed in our work that traditionally commons are conceived as the high seas, outer space, or the forests that are empowering the earth. Yet, I have insisted that there is another definition. For us, global commons are defined by three basic propositions. The first one is that the planet is our only home, that we have to protect it through a global citizenship, sustainable development education. The second, global commons, are predicated on the idea that global peace is an intangible cultural good of humanity with immaterial value. Global peace is a treasure of humanity. The third, global commons, are substantiated on the need to find ways that people who are all equal manage to live together democratically and in an ever-growing, diverse, and interconnected world. People seek to fulfill their individual and cultural interests and achieving their inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The great question about peace and sustainability is how can we cultivate the spirit of solidarity across the lines of difference? It will be important testing if the key arguments of Hartmut Rosa in his book, Resonance, a Sociology of Our Relationship to the World, applies to the way that nature and sustainability are treated in teachers' training institutions and curriculum, for instance. Do teaching about sustainability experience nature not only as a scarce resource, but also as a sphere of resonance, which in turn enhances the motivation of individuals to desire nature preservation and the rationale for sustainable practices. What is the framework that animates the teaching of sustainability in teachers' training institutions? Is it related to the trilogy of dimensions or crisis of environmental, political, and subjective relationships, which have been suggested by Rosa and many other scholars? The argument is powerful because the roots of this crisis in all three dimensions is that a structurally institutionalized and culturally legitimated strategy of expanding humanity's share of the world paradoxically results in a progressive loss of the world and thus in the muting of our axis of resonance. In other terms, we keep claiming that we want more and more defense of the environment, and we keep encroaching upon the environment. And this is creating all sorts of complications of different kinds. In other terms, an instrumental approach to nature, which may be subtly connected to the normative or moral commitments, may seem betrayed by daily unsustainable practices. In this situation, this experience of self-efficacy may result in reifying domination. So there are all sorts of conundrums to the sustainability practices and eventual alienation in our relation with nature. A crucial element for political economy is the argument presented by Rosa in the escalation-oriented expansion of humanity dominating the late modern subject relation to the self. What is the implication to nature voices? Addressing this point have implications for sustainability education, but also global citizenship education. What are these conundrums and contradictions treated in the pre-service teachers training if they are addressed at all in some form of shape? How are they understood in the context of the predominant normative and analytic metrics in teachers training institutions? Global citizenship may help our planet, global peace, and people through its contribution to civic engagement in its classical dimension of knowledge, skills, and values. There is a cosmopolitan imperative, as suggested in many publications by Ulrich Beck, an imperative of economic equality, welfare, and cultural diversity that may produce an individual that may admire others more for their differences than for their similarities. The protection of global commons via global citizenship education need to be supplemented by holistic conceptions of sustainability, including its three classical dimensions of ecological, economic, and social. More than 4 decades ago, our Common Future report of the World Commission on Environment and Development created the basis for this holistic conception of sustainability that involves these three dimensions: ecological, economic, and society on a global level. While the ecological dimension is concerned with the maintenance of national capital, the economic dimension refers to companies' ability to create value and enhance financial performance. Simultaneously, the social dimension refers to social and cultural justice, such as discrimination, exploitation, cultural barriers, social and political exclusion of vulnerable groups, and the risk of cultural extinction of ethnic and language minorities in society. Despite the important role of the social dimension in the study of sustainability, research on sustainable development is often focused on the economy and environmental dimensions, what some people call green capitalism. Consequently, a social agenda is often neglected in the sustainability field research. So I will say that sustainability research, as well as international policies for sustainable development, shows that teachers are central and vital actors to educate a new generation for sustainable development. With this background, teachers training education is considered a crucial institution necessary to develop public awareness on issues related to sustainability. From the twin perspective of education for sustainable development and education for citizenship education, let me offer you some questions that merit attention. What are the perceptions, aspirations, expectations, and values of student teachers, professors, and administrators of teacher education program regarding issues of sustainability and GCE? To what extent does a culture of sustainability exist within the work of teachers training institution? And if so, how it is represented in the curriculum and instruction? What are the challenges and controversies in teaching sustainability and GCE? Let me give you one. The main fallacy of the Sustainable Development Goals is that it emphasizes a productive model which will undermine the basic premises of defending nature. And therefore, that fallacy needs to be consequently understood, confronted, and discussed in all its possibilities and limits. To define the best policies, practices in teaching sustainability and GCE, what are the similarities and differences between institutions in the way they do planning, teaching, evaluating, perception of sustainability and GCE? This research will wonder if these programs of sustainability seek to identify the principle of resonance between nature and human beings in model culture, as strongly suggested by Hartmut Rosa in his analysis of vertical axis of resonance. Let me tell you just a simple example that we need to progress. When I came to UCLA 30 years ago, 32 years ago, that was a very conservative school based on method and the traditional schools of education. But in, say, 10, 15 years, the new people that were hired began to create a new model. And that model was based, believe it or not, on a Kantian categorical imperative of social justice education. So now, this school that is ranked #1 in the US is considered social, school-oriented to social culture justice. We don't have yet what we need to do in our second attempt, an attempt to incorporate the holistic model, global social culture for the planet. And that is still pending in our own work. Let me offer you some reflections about the real and pressing needs products of the pandemic, with a mysterious, vicious killer and mutant virus, which challenges science, forcing science ingenuity and its limits, while we are waiting to see if vaccines, created in record time, work. There is no question that sustainable development is on the table. With or without pandemic, even if the virus will be with us for a long time, climate change and sustainability need to be addressed in any future new normal. The new utopia of the SDGs represent, if achieved, even with all its contributions, an immense progress. We will witness strong changes with renewable energies, electric cars, virtual congresses like this one, or meat produced in laboratories rather than from cows. My conclusion is very simple. We need our better angels to make sure this real utopia is a possible one. Thank you very much for your attention.
Right. Thank you very much, Carlos. That was great. Thank you. A very rich presentation there and a whole wealth of points that I'm sure we'll want to pick up on and discuss. But I'd like now to pass on to Manuela, who I'm sure is well known to many of you, who's had a long history of engagement in some of the fields around global education, and particularly engaged in work around peace and human rights education. Manuela, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doug, for the invitation to participate in the Congress. And it's a great honor for me to be a speaker and to share the table with Carlos. So I would begin my presentation with some image. So this picture is from Ceuta last week. It's a police rescuing a baby. And then I would like to show this other one. And this is a Red Cross volunteer. And she called Luna, and she's hugging a person from Senegal who just arrived to the coast. This image I would like to share with you because it's about vulnerability. It's about the vulnerability we have as a human beings, and the simplicity of a huge or a baby rescue from the water connect us with the deepest sense of care and allow us to fight against deshumanization and the cold figures that often distance us from certain situations in which we are involved. So this phenomena affect us as a global citizenship, and we I think it's important to remark that borders, that there are many phenomena that are beyond the borders of the nation state, and it is therefore suggested that the concept of citizenship linked with a specific territory needs to be extended to the concept of global citizenship linked to a global territory on which we have responsibilities as a human beings. Global citizenship education is about how to address global problems related to global warming, migrations, violence, and trying to define a common agenda for action and based on shared values. So these are some of the questions. I would like to stress specifically the inequality, because as is already said, the pandemic has brought changes that were unimaginable months ago. So we have seen in a very short time change that we never expected. and we were not prepared for this. So the situation of global risk has been announced for years in various international studies and reports produced by academia and research center. In fact, Ulrich Beck, the sociologist Ulrich Beck, has suggested that we were living in a global risk society, and he points out that these risks are distributed unequally among countries, territories, and social groups. But it's not just about health risks, but there are another threats related to global warming, which challenge us to take preventive measures to help ensure the life and survival of the planet. So the pandemic has exacerbated some dynamics that existed before, and one of them is this inequality, that also the weakening of health system and public policies as a result of decades of neoliberal policies, and in particular the cycle of austerity that came with the 2008 crisis, and also the weakening of the global governance structure, in particular the United Nations and regional bodies. Our capacity to respond to these global challenges has been significantly reduced at a time that requires cooperative and concerted action at a global and local levels. So in this context, I would like to answer to this question, that is what means global citizenship education in this context? How does global citizenship education address these global problems that we are confronted? And global citizenship education can provide a way of learning, a way of doing, and a way of being in the world. Let me start for the first one. So, a way of learning about the complexity of the world. Global citizenship education provides strategies to overcome the mental frameworks that fragment, separate, and divide societies, fueled by fear and uncertainty. It proposes strategies to help overcome the dynamics of polarization that confront societies and that have become increasingly embedded in the political and social sphere. This means overcoming dualism, for example, good, evil, friend, enemy, person, nature, mind, body. So it is about overcoming the approaches of mechanistic, reductionist, and deterministic science. It's about approaching more complex analysis that allows us to build bridges, generate links and complicity between people in order to achieve cohesive and resilient societies. Global citizenship education pursue the collective construction of knowledge that incorporates the knowledge of multiple actors, that seeks interdisciplinarity, holistic vision, and positive synergies, that is subject to questions that can be applied in a given context and also from a global approach, and that can generate changes and transform reality. We need a universalistic ethic that recognizes and values diversity. This requires deconstructing all concepts and redefining them, overcoming essentialism and determinism that limits analysis and understanding. So in the current context, solidarity and cooperation are more necessary than ever to face the great global challenges, because either we all save or none of us we will save. So education must incorporate new interpretative frameworks to address the major global issues that affect humanity and that the pandemic has made more visible and urgent. So this implies a process of incorporating and deepening some concepts and redefining others to enable critical understanding of the phenomena related to the global world and the existing risks and how to respond to them. It also requires the incorporation of a new analytical categories to help interpret the new realities. So we need new concepts to name global phenomena and to interpret them on the basis of a cognitive frameworks that connect knowledge with capacity and values, thus shaping emancipatory narrative that place human being as the center. And this must be done incorporating the relationship between local and the global, and the relationship between past, present, and future in the analysis of global processes at the political, social, cultural, environmental, and technological levels. So I want to point to several key concepts in this process. The first one is the concept of interdependence. It's about recognizing the interdependence relationship that exists in the political, economic, and social sphere, and that we have as a human being. A mutual link that forces us to develop strategies to overcome individualism and exclusionary nationalism as a society, and that compel us to recognize ourselves as a global society, as a citizens of the world will remain linked to our local environment. It is about facing global risks from the local level through a collective action to defend, promote the common good. Secondly, the concept of global public goods that also Carlos has spoken about it. Global public goods are those goods that belong to us as humanity and are available to all people. As defined by Inge Cole, they are almost universal goods with cuts across group, population, and borders, including present and future generations, and benefit all countries, people, and nations. There are public goods, health, knowledge, biodiversity, among others. So this involves, on a global scale, guarantee the provision and care of global public goods and facilitating their enjoyment by all people. Health as a global public good implies moving toward universal health coverage and access to vaccines. This requires international cooperation and coordination of national actions. Thirdly, the epistemologies of South, the concept that of Boaventura Sousa Santos, which implies a recognition of diversity of knowledge, traditionally excluded and ignored, and that they are necessary to address the complexity of the present moment we are living. Fourthly, global citizenship education must incorporate feminist perspective. The feminist movement has been calling for years for care and to be placed at the center of policies and for all life sustaining tasks to be properly valued. Incorporating women historically neglected knowledge and experience is essential for a better understanding of the problems facing by humanity, as well as for the joint search for solutions. So the pandemic has put the importance of care in the center, and it has shown how they are undervalued and precarious, and also how they are mostly assumed by women. During the pandemic, the enormous burden and risk assumed by women, particularly those from the lower classes, often migrant women, in care work, in home, in education activity, or in cleaning have increased. This situation bring back to table the importance of this task being recognized and valued as well as shared equally. Fifth, it is necessary to redefine the classic concept of security to adopt the human security concept with focus on the needs of people and the planet. Peace and security must guarantee the right to live in dignity with access to health, education, housing, and other needs. It's also about confronting the symbolic and cultural violence that denies the different and the diversity and that legitimize the use of force and imposition. Also that to confront dissent through polarization and hate speeches and by constructing the image of enemy. It is very important to deconstruct the imaginary of war that legitimizes the exploitation of resources in favor of the war and death industry and to detriment of human life, social justice, equity, and nature. We have seen that weapons have done little to confront the pandemic and to ensure our security. And we have gone from fighting the virus to cohabiting with it, with the consequent protective measure that this situation requires. It is therefore necessary to delegitimize security logics, which entail enormous risk and imply relations of individual and collective subordination to a higher authority. The alternative is human cooperation and responsibility. In short, we need a paradigm shift in the interpretation of reality, which conforms to another way of looking and imagining the world in which we live, based on values and practice that promote solidarity, dialogue, empathy, and resilience. Education can play a very important role, fostering this multiple language and offering conceptual, analytical, and emotional tools that facilitate decision-making in the face of complex problems, that help to imagine new lives, scenarios, and that help to manage uncertainty and fears, putting together rationality and emotions, search and discovery, the visible and invisible. Second is a way of doing. Global citizenship education proposes a way of doing to face the global challenges and developing capacities and competence for living in a global world. It's a way of networking, connecting and linking those people and organizations that work to build a more just society, promoting resilience, building from adversity, and exploring new paths and ways of acting. It promotes the moral imagination, this concept of proposed by the researcher Jean-Paul Lederach, that he says that this concept transcends violence and injustice and it tries to build new scenarios of future. He said the art of creating what does not exist yet, whose very existence has a performative function that transforms reality. And third is a way of being. Global citizenship education proposes a way of being, feeling part of a global community, building the concept of universality with the capacity of agency to act and commit ourselves to the future to come. In summary, we are in a turning point, and the choice we collectively make now will be decisive for our future. Global education, global citizenship education proposes a way of learning, a way of doing, and a way of being in order to respond to the systematic crisis we face. And for this, it is important to converse with the experience of international solidarity, which brings people closer together, to incorporate the experience of pacifism and the peaceful transformation of conflicts, the experience of feminism and its commitment to equality, the experience of environmentalism group, which remind us of the urgency of stopping global warming before it's too late, and to do so from the vindication of hope as an engine of change, because education for global citizenship believes that change is possible. So it is about exploring the possibilities, however remote, to create alternatives to this unequal war. Therefore, we trust that this crisis will become an opportunity to remake, to reinvent the future, as Federico Mayor Zaragoza points out, because as the American activist and pacifist Cora Wise says, when we dream alone, it is nothing more than a dream. But when we dream together, the dream can become reality. The future is yet to be made, and for that, we count on all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuela. That's great. Thank you very much. And very rich presentation, and builds on very similar comments made by Carlos, and very much go quite close together. So a lot of issues I'm sure people would like to discuss, from both what Carlos has covered and what Manuela's covered. You know, Carlos talked about this century of sustainability. Manuela's talked about a whole number of the current concepts and the future, about ways of doing and ways of being, another way to look at the world. So both presenters talking a lot about how we prepare for the future, what roles that we play in these issues as educators. I think I'm going to have to bring the session to a close. I'm sure we could go on for another hour on some of these comments and conversations, but I think particularly the connections that you've both made between global citizenship and sustainability and the role of Sustainable Development Goals, but also looking at the current political and social and economic context around the world. And also, as Carlos has just ended there, by looking about the options we have in terms of the future and the possibilities of moving forward. To me, reflect very much what's one of the underlying themes of this conference, which is about hope and a pedagogy of hope, and how we take those things forward. So in conclusion, I'd like to thank Carlos and Manuela for their excellent contributions. I'd like to thank you all for your inputs and comments in the chat, and your discussion groups were helpful and useful. Thank you very much for participating this afternoon, and goodbye, everyone. Thank you.